message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the non-fiction author Richard Dawkins.
We spoke to Richard about moving from research science to writing books for a general audience, about his breakout book, The Selfish Gene, in 1976, and about his latest title, The Genetic Book of the Dead.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Richard, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the podcast. We wanted to start out with The Genetic Book of the Dead, so your new book. It's described as a look at how the body, behaviour and genes of every living creature can be read as a book. When did you begin to develop the idea to write this book?
There is a chapter in an earlier book, Unweaving the Rainbow, which I think was 1998, called The Genetic Book of the Dead, which begins to think along those lines. So I suppose it goes back that far.
And so how did you build on that chapter? How did you go about kind of deepening the research and drawing out the ideas that you'd already laid out back then?
Well, the idea itself is based upon natural selection. That natural selection shapes the animal, shapes its body via its genes. And so I felt that in principle, it should be possible to reconstruct the selection pressures, and that means the environmental selection pressures of its ancestors. There must be signals from the past in the animal at present, including its genome, signals rather like the signals which, say, an archaeologist gets from just the traces of remains in the soil and under the sand of the desert. It's amazing what a lot science can glean from looking into great detail. There's a nice parallel too in the belief that predated Fraunhofer that we could never ever know the chemical nature of the stars. And yet we now know, and actually it was beginning to be known even then, that from the spectrum, from the spectrum of the light coming from the stars, you can indeed get a lot of information about the chemistry of it. So I have a kind of faith, really, that the scientists of the future will be able to get signals from the past via the animals of the present and their genomes.
And a recurrent theme in your writing has been making complicated ideas accessible to a lay reader, particularly regarding the new book. How have you done that, and what were some of the challenges you had to take on in order to make this a book that someone without necessarily scientific training could engage with?
I'm never very good at analysing how I do it. I suggested, actually in my very first book, The Selfish Gene, that I read it through. I read my stuff through over and over and over again through the eyes of imaginary readers. So it might be just my aunt or my grandmother or somebody I've just written a letter to, and I more or less unconsciously, next time I read it through their eyes and spot things that they wouldn't understand, and so change it. So in a way, my writing is subjected to a kind of Darwinian natural selection. It's partly sending it out to real readers, but it's perhaps even more importantly, my own imagination of how a particular hypothetical reader might read it, might misunderstand, might need clarification.
So when you say you send it out to real readers, who are those people that you test it on, or is that later on?
It might be a colleague who knows a lot about the subject, or it might be a layperson who knows nothing about the subject, and I do both.
And again, with nonfiction writers in general, we often ask about research and the research process. With a book like this, or also earlier titles that you've worked on, to what extent are you doing research specifically for the book, and to what extent is it the inverse, that the book is a kind of synthesis or a distillation of research you have done as part of your academic career?
Most of the latter, I think. I don't sort of set out like some authors might to do research on a particular topic. I've been reading lately the novels of Arthur Haley for light relief, and he clearly goes and does research into the hotel business or the airline business, and then spends a year immersing himself in that particular topic and then writes a book about it. I don't do that. It's rather more an accumulation over the years.
And this book includes illustrations as well. And you've worked with the same illustrator in a previous book. How does that relationship work? At what stage are they looking at the manuscript, drawing up ideas?
Well, we work very closely together, and she reads the book, and she, to some extent, picks out things that are worth illustrating. To some extent, I suggest things that are worth illustrating. It's a kind of symbiosis. It's a joint effort.
And you've said that this book is aimed at the same audience as The Selfish Gene. Do you have a sense of who these people are, of who your kind of key readers are? And is there anything about that demographic that surprised you or was unexpected?
When I wrote The Selfish Gene, I distinguished, I think, 3 readers, including the student, the professional, and the layperson. And that's still the case. I've learned a lot more from the intervening years when readers have written letters to me or have come up to me in book signing queues. I think it's pretty clear. I'm rather pleased about this, that a lot of people have been influenced. And they've said this, they've said as much, and they've said that in many cases they've actually said that I've inspired them to go into a career of science. So I listen to what they say, I read what they write, and learn from that.
And so for any listeners who have not yet got their hands on a copy of the book, I mean, this is research that you've been thinking about for a while, but what are some of the surprising findings that you lay out in this book?
I suppose the last chapter, which I regard as a kind of sting in the tail, which is the suggestion that all our own genes can be regarded as symbiotic viruses, a gigantic colony of viruses. It's not really worth bothering to distinguish between those, the roughly 8% that really are viruses that have incorporated themselves over the millennia into the genome, and our own genes, which for Darwinian reasons can be thought of as though they were symbiotic viruses, a colony of symbiotic viruses. This is a sort of surprising, I wouldn't say it's a result of research, it's a result of sort of my imagination, and it may be subject to criticism.
We also saw the book referred to as a kind of ode to the beauty or wonder of nature, and that seems to have been a key factor for you and in your intellectual journey, both from an idea of design or creation, moving away to an atheistic position. Do you still have a kind of aesthetic regard for nature and for the organisms and animals you write about?
Well, very much so, yes. And it's not only the more the sort of more David Attenborough type reveling in the beauty of nature, but it's also reveling in the sheer complexity of it, the sheer improbability of it, the philosophical problem of explaining how the illusion of design comes about. I mean, it's a profound, or was a profound mystery before Darwin came along, how it was possible for the laws of physics working on such simple things as atoms, molecules, to put together prodigies of complexity, such as an animal or a human or a tree.
We'd like to come back to the new book later on in the conversation, but can we roll back now to your early life? You were born in Kenya, and am I right in thinking that your father was very interested in natural history?
Yes, he read botany at Oxford, and he was much more of a naturalist than I am. He knew the Latin names of all the wildflowers, and he would regale me and my sister with them. And everywhere we went, we were sort of conscious that he was a naturalist. And I really wasn't to the same extent. I was rather more bookish. I think perhaps to his disappointment, I think he'd have liked me to have been more of a naturalist.
And could you tell us about your movement into and out of organised religion as a young person? We saw that you described it as a normal Anglican upbringing, but then lost your faith as a teenager. But we also saw this rather moving story about being driven back from Oxford after your university entrance exam and discussing with the headmaster and having a kind of different view of organised religion at that stage. Take us through that period of your life.
Yes. The headmaster, headmasters I think always are rather forbidding characters just by virtue of their office. And it was rather nice to be driven back from Oxford by him and his wife in his ancient Rolls Royce. And learning that headmasters actually are just nice, civilized people with whom you can have a conversation. He didn't censure me. By that time, it was clear that I was being quite rebellious against religion and refusing to kneel down in chapel and that kind of thing. And he didn't attack me for that. He was rather more sympathetically curious as to what I was thinking. And I think I learned a lot from that.
Do you think that's contributed to your kind of continued interest to debate people with whom you disagree today?
I'm not sure about that. I don't enjoy debating for its own sake. I'm not a kind of natural arguer, I think. I rather prefer to find places where we can agree. But perforce, I have been involved in argument with people. And I hope I do it in a sort of respectful way. Perhaps not always, but I do my best.
And you studied zoology at Oxford, focusing on animal decision-making. At that stage in your life and your career, did you think that you would be writing in due course for a wider audience?
I don't think I did, no. I think I didn't really look very far ahead. I was doing research of a rather esoteric mathematical nature in animal behaviour. And I think I pretty much drifted into my later career, which didn't happen until I was about 35, when I wrote The Selfish Gene. Well,
that leads us nicely onto The Selfish Gene. How did that come about? When did you decide to actually kind of sit down and write that book?
There had been a number of books for a popular audience by biologists and by others, which seemed to me to get it wrong in a rather important way. They were treating altruism and cooperation in animals as though it was for the good of the species. And I singled out Conrad Lawrence, who's a very famous biologist, and Robert Ardrey, who was rather a good playwright who wrote books for a popular audience on science. And the idea that what animals do is for the good of the species is fundamentally wrong. And I wanted to put that right. And in thinking about the best way to put that, I realized that the true level at which animals are guided is the level of the gene. So it's the gene which is naturally selected, and animals should be regarded as survival machines for the genes that ride inside them. So I began to write this book in about 1972, I think it was. It was the time when there was a lot of industrial unrest, and I was not able to carry on with my laboratory research because that needed electricity and the power cuts. There were power cuts all the time, a so-called 3-day week. So I couldn't get on with my research, so I thought I would write a book. And I started to write this book, and I'd only completed 2 chapters before the industrial unrest came to an end and the power came back on, and I resumed my laboratory research. And then I came back to it about 3 years later, that I got a sabbatical leave. And by that time, the biological literature had grown, and some important, relevant new ideas had come to the fore, so I was able to incorporate them into a book.
Just on this question of audience and looking at it in a slightly longer context, going back to the 19th century and to Darwin or to Huxley, these titanic figures of the field at that stage, who was reading their books? Did they have a popular audience as well in the 19th century?
Yes, Darwin was much read. I mean, the first edition of The Origin of Species sold out almost immediately, and he then wrote 6 editions altogether, and it had an immense impact, both positive and negative. And Huxley too. Huxley was a popular lecturer who took up the cudgels on Darwin's behalf. So Darwin was a figure, a known figure in the 19th century, to the extent that he was actually in the end buried in Westminster Abbey at the instigation of Huxley. Darwin himself wanted to be buried in the local parish church at Down in Kent, but Huxley and others used their influence to get Darwin buried in Westminster Abbey, which is an indication of how widely known and respected he was.
His champion to the end. And then in the early 1970s, what was the state of science writing like when you were starting to put together The Selfish Gene?
Desmond Morris had recently published The Naked Ape, which was a huge bestseller and probably aimed at a rather wider audience than The Selfish Gene, actually. I mean, it was sort of rather more populist, I think. That was a big one. This was before Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, which was the mega bestseller. So The Selfish Gene kind of straddled both. I actually developed the ideas of The Selfish Gene 10 years earlier in 1966, which was, I think, about the time when The Naked Ape was published, and gave lectures in Oxford and in Berkeley, California, which foreshadow The Selfish Gene.
We always like on the podcast to get into the mechanics of, particularly with authors' first books or early books, how they went about getting a publisher and an agent. So with the example of The Selfish Gene, what was the process from this idea and the interruption of your laboratory work to getting the book out into the world?
When I had written those first 2 chapters that I mentioned, I happened to be visited by a publisher's agent. Publishers tend to go around science labs kind of hawking for books. And so I gave him these 2 chapters, and he liked them and said, if you ever finish the book, get in touch, which I didn't do. I showed it to Desmond Morris when it was finished, well, almost finished. And he advised me to go to Tom Mashler, who was the head of Jonathan Cape, and a leading figure in British publishing at the time. So I went to Tom Mashler's office in London, and pretty imposing it was, a huge, great, tall, high ceilings book line, and he was a very reputed publisher. He liked the book, said the title was wrong, said it should be called The Immortal Gene. He said that selfish is a down word. He wanted to call it The Immortal Gene, which is a more poetic word, and he is very possibly right. And I was sort of toying with the idea of sending it to him, back to Jonathan Cape. Meanwhile, in New College, which was my college, where I was a fellow of New College, still am, and one of the leading figures in Oxford University Press was also a fellow of New College, and he got to hear of it, and he mentioned it to one of the editors at Oxford University Press, Michael Rogers. Michael Rogers asked to see the book, and was immediately very enthusiastic, so much so that I couldn't resist this sheer power of his enthusiasm. He phoned me up and yelled down the telephone, "I must have that book!" And I couldn't resist that. And so I signed up with Oxford University Press. And that was a very exciting time in my career. I spent made lots of visits to the OUP building in Oxford and got introduced to other people there. And so I got to know quite a bit of the ins and outs of the publishing world through that.
Did you bring an agent on to help with that negotiation, or did you just went straight for them?
No, I didn't know about agents in those days, so financially it was not very rewarding. I did not get a very big advance. The advance that I did get happened to be exactly the right sum to buy the painting by Desmond Morris, which had earlier turned into the cover illustration. It's called The Expectant Valley. Michael Rogers and I went to visit Desmond Morris in his house in North Oxford, and we saw all his paintings, surrealist paintings of a sort of biological nature. And This particular one caught our eye, at least partly because there was a good bit of space at the top for the title of the book. So we decided to with Desmond's agreement, to use that painting as the cover of the book. It sort of looks biological. It's called The Expectant Valley. It's got a figure in the middle that's obviously about to sort of burst with reproduction. Anyway, then Desmond happened to have an exhibition in Oxford where his paintings were for sale. And this particular painting was in the sale. And the price of it was exactly the sum of the advance which Oxford University Press had given me. So I glued it on this painting.
The book was a huge success. It sold over 1 million copies. It's been described as bringing about a silent and almost immediate revolution in biology. A poll listed it as the most influential science book of all time, ahead even of Darwin. We always find it very interesting with authors who've had a huge success to get a sense of when it was clear that was going to happen, if it was a slow burn or a sudden thing, and if they're able to pinpoint the factors that led to the book really breaking out. And often we find it's actually very difficult to do that. But when did you get a sense that it had really taken off?
I was inexperienced. I didn't know about things like slow burners. I've learned about it since. It was immensely widely reviewed. I'm not quite sure why this was, but I was, the publisher obviously sent me all the reviews, and there were, I think, more than 100 reviews of it from all around the world. And I suppose with hindsight, I could have got a sense that it was going to do well from the mere fact that it was reviewed so much. In those days, there was no internet, so it was just magazines and newspapers that counted. And there was a huge number of reviews, almost all favourable, actually. One or two notable ones that were negative, but mostly they were favourable.
Do you think it would have been so widely reviewed if it had been called The Immortal Gene?
It's a very good question. I don't know. Michael Rogers is adamant that The Selfish Gene was the right title. I have toyed with the idea that it should have been called The Immortal Gene. At the end of one of the chapters in the Genetic Book of the Dead, I've illustrated 4 possible alternative titles, including The Immortal Gene and The Cooperative Gene, and the slightly selfish big bit of a chromosome and the even more selfish little bit of chromosome, which wouldn't exactly have gone down well with the public, I think. I don't know. I vacillate between thinking The Immortal Gene would have been the right title and The Selfish Gene was the right title.
When we speak to historians, we often find that there's a certain amount of tension between so-called academic historians and so-called popular historians, and particularly that there could be a kind of two-way envy between success and having a wide reading audience and being within the academy. What was, with your work, both with The Selfish Gene and elsewhere, what was the response from your academic peers? And has that changed over time?
That's very interesting. John Maynard Smith, who is a leading figure in my field as an academic biologist, wrote retrospectively a sort of review of The Selfish Gene plus The Extended Phenotype, which is my second book. And he said that the selfish gene was unusual in being aimed at and read by lay people, but at the same time being influential on professionals. And I like to think that's right. I think it's true that field biologists, academic biologists who actually work on animal behavior in the wild, in Africa and in the field, are actually influenced by it. I think that when they look at an animal behaving, they say to themselves, what is it about the animal's behavior that benefits its genes? And that I think is new. That I think, although they would have read the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 1930s, which essentially says that, they perhaps didn't really take it on board until The Selfish Gene kind of rammed it home in a more vivid way. So I think I like to think Maynard Smith was right, that this book, he likened it to David Lack's Life of the Robin, which he said was also aimed both at professionals and at lay people. I like to think that it did have both effects.
So there was no kind of jealousy from your peers, or at least no expressed jealousy of your breakout success?
I don't know about that. I'm not sure whether I would be told if there was. There's a thing in America called the Carl Sagan effect, which is brought out to explain why Carl Sagan was never elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which is the equivalent of the Royal Society. And that is often put down to jealousy. I have been elected to the Royal Society, and I'm very grateful for that. I haven't encountered overt jealousy of the kind that you mention, but it may be there.
You mentioned Stephen Hawking and The Brief History of Time earlier. This may well, be just publishing rumor, but the story that we've heard about that is it sold huge numbers of copies, but it wasn't read by many people because it was complicated and relatively inaccessible. Do you get a sense that, people always read your books to read them, not to have them on the shelf? Or do you think there may be any demographic that does that?
I have actually read A Brief History of Time. It is difficult. I think not because it's badly written, but because the subject matter is difficult. You can't help being difficult if you're writing about modern physics. I think that The Selfish Gene and my other books are different. I think that people really do read them. I like to think they are comprehensible to lay people. And the feedback I'm getting is that they are indeed read.
And The Selfish Gene also gave birth to the field of memetics and the idea of meme as a kind of process of cultural evolution. What was that like in terms of kind of sowing the seeds of a new field of academic inquiry?
Well, it seemed a good way to end The Selfish Gene, because The Selfish Gene was all about the gene as the unit of natural selection, because the gene is potentially immortal and replicates. It's a replicator. It makes copies of itself. And that's the basis of it. That's why it is suitable as a unit of natural selection. And I wanted to emphasize that the general point that it is replicators that matter, not specifically DNA. And so I mentioned the possibility that on other planets there might be life, and if so, then there would be some equivalent of DNA. There would be a replicator at its base. But then I said, well, maybe we don't need to go to other planets. Maybe there's a new replicator staring us in the face on this planet. In those days, either computer viruses hadn't been invented or I didn't know about them, but I could have used computer viruses as an example, but I didn't. I use the meme instead, the unit of cultural inheritance, because units of cultural inheritance are replicators. They do spread. They do spread like a virus. In fact, I use the phrase virus of the mind. And so potentially a meme could be a unit of natural selection. There's no doubt at all that memes exist in the sense of being replicators. It's less obvious that they serve as Darwinian replication sense of being naturally selected. For that to be true, it would be necessary that you show that some of them survive better than others. And that, I suppose, you could do. It's almost obvious that certain things, like certain tunes, certain habits, certain clothes fashions survive better than others. That is a kind of Darwinian process. To be really good as an analogy to Darwinian selection, they would have to give rise to some interesting evolutionary change. And possibly the meme complex, something like a religion, like Roman Catholicism, could be an example of that, where a whole complex of memes survives in each other's presence to build up something bigger.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Another point that comes up with writers across genre who we speak to is that following up a big hit is difficult. So you'd written The Selfish Gene with no expectation, kind of as a spec project, and it had been this huge success. How did you decide with your writing in what direction you wanted to go next, and what was that process like, both practically but also emotionally?
I continued to do my work as an Oxford lecturer and tutor, but I rather quickly gave up on laboratory research and concentrated on writing further books. And I produced a spate of further books, rather differently from most of my academic colleagues. I suppose I enjoyed doing it and enjoyed having some influence over the way people thought.
How are your days divided in terms of your academic responsibilities and your book writing?
When I was an Oxford tutor, I had to do a lot of tutorials and a lot of lectures, and so I didn't have that much free time. I suppose I fitted it in whenever I could. Then when I was about 1995 or so, I was very lucky to get a professorship, a named professorship, the Charles Simonia Professorship for the Public Understanding of Science, which freed me from those earlier responsibilities, which I'd enjoyed at the time, but perhaps been doing them for long enough. So I was then freed to write books most of the time, and that was a great release for me. So I then wrote a lot of books after that.
And again, on the pragmatics and practicalities of the writing industry, after this huge success, when did you get an agent and get representation? And then how did you move to more major trade publishers rather than academic presses?
I was approached by an agent in London and signed up with her, and she did the usual agent thing and negotiated the sale of my second popular book, which was The Blind Watchmaker. I was very devoted to the particular individual publisher at OUP, Michael Rogers. By that time, Michael Rogers had moved on from OUP to Longmans, and so I was pretty keen to do my next book with him, and that was arranged. And so my second and I think third book were published by Longmans originally, and then I was approached by a New York agent, John Brockman, who specializes in science books. And he persuaded me that I should change my loyalties to him. And so I did. And most of the rest of my books have been negotiated by the Brockman agency. So that's the story of my agenting. Just lately, my last two books, I have not been arranged by an agent. I had got to know a particular publisher, Anthony Cheetham, who is a sort of a senior figure in this publishing world. And my last two books, Flights of Fancy and The Genetic Book of the Dead, have been directly done through Anthony Cheetham and not going via an agent.
And another question that we put to any authors that have had a big success is how it's changed things for them financially. So tell us as much or as little as you'd like, but with The Selfish Gene, you've mentioned that, later on you were freed up to focus on writing more, but, could you have taken that step to be a full-time writer at that point?
I suppose I could. The implication is that I've made a lot of money, and certainly if you were to look up at one time one of those dreadful websites that give the wealth of individuals, got a hugely inflated figure. I'm not sure where that figure came from, nor am I sure really where all the money's gone, if there was any. It doesn't seem to have stayed around very much. So I suppose I could have given up being an Oxford Don at that point, but I didn't want to. I mean, I was a dedicated teacher, and I wanted to go on doing that.
This is jumping forward a little bit, but with the God Delusion in 2006, we saw that you had long wanted to write a book criticizing religion, but you'd been advised against it. But that changed in 2006, around that time. Could you tell us about the long gestation of that idea, if that is correct?
Yes. I had earlier suggested to John Brockman, my agent, that I should do effectively the God Delusion in the late 90s, and he advised against it. He said, you can't write a book against religion, it won't sell in America. He then changed his mind after 9/11, after the George W. Bush had been in power for a while, and he said, now is the time to write the God Delusion. And so that was the delay. That was why there was that delay.
And it sold more than 3 million copies. Do you have a sense of how many of those were in America?
I think about half. I think it's more than 3 million, actually. And yes, I think about half in America.
And to what extent did it feel, maybe team effort is the wrong word, but that you were part of a wider cultural moment with Christopher Hitchens and with other people taking similar lines?
Yes, not much, actually. I mean, I think it was largely coincidental that I think four of us wrote books at roughly the same time, Sam Harrison, Dan Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens and I. There was certainly no coordinated movement there. With hindsight, a movement has been labelled and designated the New Atheist or the Four Horsemen or things like that. But these are journalistic tags which we never invented nor owned.
What's the experience of writing The God Delusion any different to any of your other books?
Not really. I mean, I like explaining things. I like making cases. And no, I think it's all part of the same course.
And in terms of the reaction and the debate that it generated, it stirred, did that develop along the lines you expected it to, or were there surprises along the way?
I don't think there were any surprises, really. I think perhaps I was slightly surprised by the sheer number of reply books that it generated. There were about at least more than 20, well over 20 books, which in one way or another made allusion to the God Delusion, things like the Dawkins delusion, deluded by Dawkins, various permutations of that sort, many of them even using the same or a derivative cover design. So that I wasn't quite expecting, and that was quite amusing in a way.
Yeah, imitation, flattery and all of that. In 2006, you also set up the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to set that up and what it does in practice?
Yes, I'm very keen on reason and science, obviously. I think they go together, and the attack on religion is all part of that, attack on superstition generally, the focus on rationalism, the skepticism, the avoidance of superstition, that kind of thing. I set up two foundations with the same name, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, one in Britain and one in America. And explicitly, part of the idea was to enable me and others to give money to America, even if we lived in Britain, to give money in a tax-efficient way, because charity law is different in Britain and America, and it's not easy to give money in a tax-efficient way to American charities. So the British Foundation was set up partly to enable me to channel money to the American Foundation for Reason and Science, where I felt it was needed most.
We discussed briefly Huxley earlier, and I was wondering, do you feel a kind of affinity for him, or feel that you've occupied any similar role? And also, in addition to that, is controversy something that you feel you enjoy or have seeked out, or do you think it's just been par for the course in the areas you're operating in? Huxley
was known as Darwin's bulldog. I've seen myself referred to as Darwin's Rottweiler. I don't feel that at all. I'm not a pugnacious type by nature. As an undergraduate, I rather identified with T.H. Huxley's grandson, Julian Huxley. I'm not quite sure why. I suppose he was Actually, he was my predecessor as tutor in zoology in New College, although that came later. I've had a sort of fascination with the Huxley family. They're obviously a very, very talented family, not just T.H. and Julian, but Aldous, the novelist, whom I devoured as a schoolboy, and Andrew Huxley, who won the Nobel Prize, also a grandson of T.H. Huxley. Andrew Huxley won a Nobel Prize for jointly discovering the nature of the nerve impulse. So yes, I suppose I do sort of have a feeling of affinity to several members of the Huxley family.
And what do you see the role of television as in terms of spreading your ideas and discussing subjects that you broach in your books?
I think television was very important, and it might have contributed to you were asking earlier about why the selfish gene did well. I think it was at least partly because of television. Nowadays, television is rather taking a back seat, I think, to the internet, because people tend not to watch mainstream television. They tend to watch on their computer screen other things, and which are sort of in some ways usurping the role of traditional television. Television has produced some outstandingly brilliant documentaries, I think especially of David Attenborough, which are quite superb, and Brian Cox and others, and I do think it has a great role to play in the promotion of science.
We've talked a lot about writing for a broader audience. I was wondering if we could talk briefly about kind of traditional scientific publishing, the peer-reviewed journal article, that system that has existed and evolved over a few hundred years. Do you think that is working at present? Is it fit for purpose as a way to disseminate information, or does that need to be reformed or rethought?
I feel personally involved in a way, because I was editor of one such journal, Animal Behavior, earlier on in my career. And I was pretty disillusioned with the format of the standard format of the scientific paper, which is introduction, methods, results, discussion. And I tried to reform that when I was editor of Animal Behavior. It showed itself most glaringly where you had a series of experiments, where experiment one worked on a particular problem and raised further problems, which were then tackled by experiment two, which raised further problems tackled by experiment three. So the natural narrative flow would be to go through experiment one and then on to experiment two, etc. Instead, what I got was methods one, methods two, methods three, methods four. Results one, results two, results three, results four. That's totally the wrong way to organize it. It breaks the narrative flow. It stops it being a story. So I tried to encourage people when I was editor to write in the form of a narrative, in the form of a story which they could identify with and follow. I think it was largely a losing battle. I think that scientific journals don't make much effort to be interesting or comprehensible, and they tend to, and perhaps academic journals generally, tend to not struggle to be understood in the way that Darwin did. I mean, Darwin struggled mightily to be understood, and I think largely successfully. And I think that authors and editors of scientific journals should pay more attention to style and trying to make themselves understood, rather than, as in some academic disciplines, actually positively show off by means of obscurantism and actually trying to make a virtue of difficult to understand. It's been called physics envy.
And what about the use of the first person? I mean, that is another point that classically is not used, right, in the experiment write-up with a lot of the passive voice and stuff like that. What's your view on that?
I really tried to clamp down hard on the passive voice and try to encourage the use of the first person singular or first person plural. Of course, I mean, that's the right way to do it. That's what happened. You actually did the experiment. You don't say the animal was taken and so and so and so and so. You have to say I took the animal. You have to tell it as a story.
Have those experiences of editing other people changed the way that you approach the editing process as an author?
I'm not sure that they changed it. I really not much to add to that. No, I try to formulate my philosophy as an editor, and I've told you about that. I suppose I try to tell stories as narratives in the sort of way that a novelist might do. Really, you know what happened next, and well, for example, in the second chapter of The Blind Watchmaker, which is largely about bats and echolocation using sonar, I try to tell the story of bat sonar in the form of a sequence of problems that the bat faces, followed by solution, which raises another problem, followed by another solution, which raises another problem. The narrative flow aids understanding and aids memory.
And how much back and forth do you have with your editors? Again, and has this changed throughout your career? I mean, do you submit before the project begins a proposed outline, or do you just aim to give a final manuscript? Just lift the bonnet a little bit on your process there.
Yes, early on I was encouraged to submit an outline and express it in chapter and things like that, which is the standard procedure. I tend nowadays not to do that so much. I tend to just sort of write it. I had one notable experience with an American editor who essentially tried to write the book himself. So I got the feeling from that experience that what he was accustomed to was being given by the author a set of lecture notes, rather chaotically jumbled, and then lick them into shape himself. And that was what he tried to do to me, and I rather resented that because I felt this was my book, not his book. And so I rather divorced myself from him and just wrote the book my way. Fair
enough. And what was the decision to write 2 memoirs, motivated by? I mean, do you think a kind of natural part of being interested in the subject of genes and ancestry, or what made you want to take that different genre and explore it?
I suppose it was a natural consequence of, and my mother was getting very old, and she died at 102, and I thought that I should tap her memory about my early life. So I wouldn't say I formally interviewed her, but I made a sort of conscious effort to get from her memories of my childhood and early life, which I was not fully equipped to put together myself. So I think that was partly the motivation for doing those 2 autobiographies. It was going to be one autobiography, and then it rather grew. So the first one, An Appetite for Wonder, is chronological in a more conventional way. The second one, which is sort of more about my professional career, chronology didn't seem to be the right way to do it, and it's rather more thematically arranged. So it was my life as a lecturer, my life as a television presenter, my life as I don't know what, this, that, and the other.
We've looked backwards quite a lot in this discussion to the 19th century and so forth. If we were to hypothetically go forward to, say, a century's time when none of us will be around, but where do you think some of these discussions about science versus religion and things like that will be in 100 years?
I find it very difficult to look into the future. In the case of science, I sort of feel science will make tremendous advances in my own field. It'll become more and more molecular. It's doing so at present. I think that physics will probably solve the problem of the unification of everything, the theory of everything, unification of quantum theory and relativity. You ask about religion. That's hard to. I mean, in the case of Christendom, I think it's fairly clear that Christianity is declining in influence and power. I wish I could say the same of Islam, and that may be a matter for the next century rather than this one.
And we're coming towards the end of our time, so it's a final question from me. You've said you're bored of being cast as a controversialist, and you think you're kind of mischaracterized. Your work, kind of either way, has angered believers around the world. Have there ever been times where you've been worried about your own safety because of your work, or have you been kind of confident that's not an issue?
No.
Do you think that, the situation that, say, Salman Rushdie has faced, there's never been a prospect of something similar yourself?
No.
Great. Okay, well, let's draw a line underneath then. Thank you so much, Richard. That was a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. And we wish you all the best with the Genetic Book of the Dead and your other projects going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Richard Dawkins. He's on Twitter at Richard Dawkins. He's on Instagram at Richard_Dawkins. And the Genetic Book of the Dead is published by Apollo. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Richard?
I thought there were some great details throughout the conversation. For instance, the story about acquiring a painting that was on the cover of his book. And also, I think just the atmosphere that surrounded the God Delusion and his publisher's wariness and how he won them round was interesting to hear about. The kind of shifting sands of the publishing industry it's a theme that comes up repeatedly on this podcast. So yeah, I thought it was interesting to hear about how he'd built his career in general. And obviously he's a very large figure in the non-fiction publishing world in general. How about you?
Yeah, I thought the stuff that was, for me, really interesting was kind of how he became a writer, right? Because he'd obviously had a kind of academic research career and that stuff from the 70s about how the selfish gene came about, how he talked about he got no money for it and spent it all on the painting, the one on the cover, as you alluded to. And then also this sense of like how a book broke out in a media landscape that's very different to today in terms of, reviews rather than internet discussion and everything like that.
And book talk.
Yeah, exactly. I thought we didn't draw him out that much on, whether he likes getting into arguments for argument's sake and stuff like that. But again, I think this is, someone who has been a major figure in, I suppose, kind of intellectual discourse in the West for a number of decades. So yeah, I thought it was a good addition to have on the podcast. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming?
I have been working on a long gestating piece, which I've probably brought up before, in fact, about the Magdalen laundries in Ireland and the wave of popular culture that is being produced about it, which is a dark but important subject. And then, I've been mostly consuming things to do with that, including the film adaptation starring Cillian Murphy of Small Things Like These. So highly recommend both the novella and the film, if anyone's interested. And then other than that, still watching Slow Horses and still enjoying it. How about you, Simon?
I'm in Wales, where I'm dog sitting for a friend of mine, and have using this opportunity to crack on with the book and push on with that. I'm more or less on schedule still, which is good. I have been reading some stuff in French by Maurice Chapin, who is a Swiss poet who I write about in my book. And his stuff actually I found rather beautiful and powerful, and some more writing by Arnold Lunn, who was a kind of pioneering mountaineer and skier. So pretty esoteric. On TV, we finished watching the Point Break, the tennis docuseries, and my admiration, which I've already talked about on the podcast, for Iga Swiatek, women's number one worldwide, continues to grow with her top mental game. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.